Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Textile Talk podcast. I'm Gail Cowley, and I'll be your host today. Joining me for this episode is Althea Crome. Just to give you a little bit of background before we start our chat, Althea is an Indiana-based fibre artist who has chosen a very niche art form to express her artistic ideas and challenge her own skills as a technician. Althea is a micro knitter and has been developing her techniques for over 20 years. Using very fine silk threads and needles that she makes herself from surgical stainless steel, she can achieve a gauge of 80 stitches per inch. With so many stitches to the inch, Althea has been able to achieve incredible detail in minute scale. Her tiny pieces of knitting are intended as a standalone, sculptural piece of art, which she often refers to as sweaterscapes. Some of her pieces tell autobiographical stories, others are romantic pastoral scenes, and many are inspired by the art and artists she admires. Althea's work has been featured around the world in shows, galleries, museums, books, and even on the silver screen in the movie Coraline. So thank you so much for joining us today, Althea. It's an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And I wonder if the first thing that I could do is perhaps ask you if you could tell us a little more about yourself, your background in general, and how you came to actually become interested in textiles and particularly in yarn and knitting.
Sure. I grew up in a little village called Yellow Springs, Ohio, and started, my parents were artists and travelers, and we lived in many places, Japan included, and the house was filled with art and a lot of color. And so I grew up very much with an artistic eye. And as I, got older, I went to college. I actually became a respiratory therapist and went to school for that, but always loved creating things. And in college, I started knitting full scale things, but my nature is one where I like challenges. So even when I was knitting in full scale, every new project that I took on had to teach me something, so I, would learn cables, or I would learn how to knit with colors. And then I started to knit smaller things, gloves and socks, and learning to do techniques like turning a heel, knitting in the round. I always pushed myself, and, that eventually led to getting, smaller and smaller. It was sort of just a funny progression that way. I like doing small scale things because I could then begin to design. I was very intimidated at first by the idea of designing in a sort of full scale sweaters, and so I liked doing baby clothes. And I had 4 children, and when I could knit in small, sort of small quantities, small bits of yarn, I began just designing my own things and found that very thrilling. And so being able to design on an even smaller scale, 1/12 scale or smaller, it was just really fun because there wasn't a big waste of yarn if it didn't turn out or it didn't fit.
Yeah.
So that sort of explains my desire for a challenge.
And you would have had lots of practice, wouldn't you, with 4 children at knitting small clothes?
Yes, for sure. And I tell you, well, 3 of them are triplets. So
Oh my goodness.
yeah. And so, yes, it was a bit of an escape. I have to admit, I think in some ways it was a way to just focus my energies somewhere else, but still kind of be present. I mean, I remember there were times when they were toddlers and running around, me sort of being focused in on my knitting with the children sort of swirling around me like a tornado.
No, I can well imagine. Um, I would think that they wouldn't be very conducive to counting your stitches or concentrating very hard on a pattern.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, it's definitely makes it more challenging,
I'm sure.
but
I'm sure.
yeah.
So you mentioned 1/12. Are your garments actually to scale? Are they to a what I would call a doll's house scale? Is that correct?
That's right, and that was sort of the scale I was attracted to when I first started, so I would say it was about 24, almost 25 years ago probably when I started doing this. Actually, it's probably been 25 years at this point. I my idea was just to make dollhouse kind of things. I was intrigued with miniatures and that, that sort of whole Alice in Wonderland magic. And that was back in the day as well when eBay was just starting. I mean, this was way early in the days of eBay. And so I got to a point where I thought, well, maybe I can try and sell some of this stuff online, which I did. I did sort of put some things on eBay, and people would contact me and say, "Oh, I would really love to have like a pair of mittens or gloves for this room that I'm doing that's like a winter skating room or something like that." And so, I had never tried doing anything like gloves or mittens, and so I would start doing things like that. So it was actually initially it combined my interest in the miniature and also the challenge of trying to make something for someone else that they wanted, but it made me force myself to try and try and try. I mean, I would attempt trying to knit a miniature mitten, as you might be able to imagine, is really difficult. Finding, I was
Yeah,
using
I could
sewing
imagine.
needles. Yeah, I was trying to use little pieces of wool. I mean, it was ridiculous looking. They look like boxing gloves. I still have the very first pair of mittens that I made, and they're funny. Um,
Mm.
but it was so fun. The challenge of it for me was so fun that I eventually learned to use much thinner threads, and I eventually learned to make my own needles and get a piece of work that was, to me looked really good. And eventually, I lost interest actually in dollhouse stuff and that whole scene, but I maintained my interest in knitting on a small scale, and that's why my pieces now are just sort of not in they're not really, even though they are 1/12 scale, they are that scale, most of them are. They're not really intended to fit on anything. They're
Mm.
intended to just sort of be displayed on their own.
As a piece of art rather than anything
Right.
that's going to fit a doll or anything. I mean,
Exactly.
micro knitting is a very niche area. I'm not aware of anyone that I can think of that does anything similar. It's just such a special thing to do, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely very niche. Yeah. And there really is there is a community of miniature needleworkers and fiber artists, people who do knit and do crochet, absolutely. I remember when I first started, there was a Yahoo group of miniature knitting and crochet, which I joined, and I learned so much from them, in terms of needles that they used, threads that they used. That was so helpful. And a lot of that group was focused on making, things for dollhouses. And I think it still remains the case. If the miniature dollhouse scene is a whole world unto itself, and there are shows that people go to, they make things for those shows. So typically if you go there, you'll see things that are intended for dollhouses, and some of those people are incredibly talented and skilled, but I kind of verged away from that and I didn't really, care about making things that looked like a Victorian layette set for a baby or, anything like that. I'm not into duplicating things that already exist. It's just, I
Mhm.
like to conceptualize sort of a piece of art in my head. It might be a painting or a sculpture, but how I express it is in this form of
Mm.
miniature micro knitting.
And how do you go about creating your patterns? Because I'm assuming that you do create a pattern before you start.
Yes, I do, and I use software. It's called Mac Stitch. It's just really a charting. It's a graph, it's like just a graph. So I can basically do a, you know, 200 by 100 empty chart. So it's like graph paper kind of.
Mm.
And then I can add whatever colors. So basically, I'm sort of creating the pattern as I see it in my head typically. And, it can take me months really to design something like that because it's like I'm sort of using the colors to fill in the pixels to create an image,
Mm.
and then I I used to write my patterns down just like you would write a knitting pattern, cast on this many stitches, knit blah 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 blah. But
Mm.
with my patterns become so complex that, in order to I really just use the chart as my design. And so if I'm designing something like a sweater or cardigan, I will just really create that design inside the chart. So my chart is my pattern. I'll do the sleeves independently. I've figured out a method for me that works where I usually knit my sleeves first, and usually I also like the sleeves to be part of the sculptural format or story or narrative. So there's always images on the sleeves as well, which will sort of follow through from the back to the front. And I'll usually knit those first, and then I'll knit the body of the sweater. Typically, when I get to the armpits, I add the sleeves, and then I go up from there, and then, do the button bands and collars and things last.
So are you doing the making up, so to speak, of the different pieces as you go along, or is that done all at the end?
Yeah, so I try to create as few seams as possible. So typically, if I were to do a cardigan, the only seam that it'll have is under the arms, from the armpit down to the wrist cuff, and that will be the only seam. So there will be no side seams, no shoulder seams. I don't like to do piecing. It doesn't First of all, it's when I'm doing an image, so a lot of times it's like a tapestry. So basically, if, I mean, it's just three-dimensional instead of doing something that's flat. The reason I love to do cardigans or polo, a sweater is because it's three-dimensional and because it's sort of I like to carry the narrative around like a 360 degree. So you sort of have to turn it or walk around it to see the whole picture.
Mm.
So it feels like there's sort of a lot of stuff going on. So if you sew seams at that scale, especially, you interrupt the images. And so
Yes.
that's why I try to really keep as few seams as possible.
Mm. And of course, you're adding, in that case, if it is a cardigan, you're often adding buttons, aren't you? Which must
Yes.
be challenging to find, or do you make your own?
Well, yeah, so there are definitely things I don't do myself, and that is most certainly one of them. I tried long ago to do it. It's just not my forte. So I have friends again in the miniature world who do things for dollhouse collectors, miniature collectors who make beautiful buttons. Some of them do sort of laser cut wooden buttons that have holes in them, and you can sew them with extremely tiny beading needles. Can sew them on. I have another friend who does absolutely gorgeous silver and enamel shank buttons, and those are just very delicate and gorgeous, and I love using those. And then I have another friend who's a machinist, and he's one of the best miniature artists that I know. He has made buttons for me that are like extremely tiny, like a millimeter and a half wide, and they're gold and they're shank. And so he's turned those on a lathe.
Wow. Oh
Ama-
my goodness.
Amazing. Yeah. Hmm.
The buttons that I know in some of your pieces are really a real focus, a
Hmm.
real
Hmm.
focal point.
Hmm.
Which comes first? Do you sort of get the buttons and then design the piece, or do you
Hmm.
design the piece and then go and look for the buttons?
Yeah, no, it's more I would design the piece first and then kind of figure out what kind of buttons go best with it. When I do a sweater, every little part of it is going to be meaningful. So I made the nativity sweater, which was it took me about a year to design and knit that sweater. And so the buttons for it, because this is based on a very beautiful triptych that is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it has gold on the frames. And so I wanted the buttons to be gold. This is my friend who designed these buttons for me. And there are 12 buttons, one for each month that it took me to make that sweater. So
Oh,
they're symbolic in a
yeah,
way.
yeah.
Um, like I made a Christmas sweater for someone once that had sort of, Christmassy holiday themes all around it and snow and whatnot. And so I wanted the buttons to look like little snowballs. And so I use little white enamel buttons for those. So I like everything to there's meaning in all of the sweaters in tiny little details everywhere that might not
Mm.
be exactly obvious when you're looking at it.
Do you actually block your pieces after you finish working them?
Yes, I do. Yeah,
Hmm.
I do. I have a special silk soap that I use, very gentle, and I'll wash them very
Mm.
carefully, by hand, obviously, just in the sink, and then block them. But they're all, since they are not pieced together, sometimes I'll block the sleeves, I'll only get them to the armpits before I attach them to the main body of the sweater. So sometimes I'll block them first before I attach them, but oftentimes I'll have to kind of create a form to
Hmm.
block the piece on while it's still wet.
So you, instead of lying them flat onto a mat,
Hmm.
you would
Right.
actually block them onto a tiny body.
Yes. Yes.
I see. So that's why they look so rounded when you,
Right.
yeah, I see. I
Right.
understand.
Right.
You must have had to develop so many of these techniques
Yeah.
yourself in order to deal with. I know that you were mentioning that you make your own needles. I mean, that just, could you tell us something about that? Because the
Yeah.
imagination boggles.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's just a process, right? I did not come to the right thing right away. And in fact, it took me years, but, because I first started using sewing needles, they're too sharp, and they're too thick, really. I tried using piano wire, but that was no good to me. I didn't like them. They were rusty. I couldn't, or they weren't rusty, but they corrode. They give off some sort of an exhaust that would get on my thread. So there were many. I tried tatting needles, not bad, but again, I could never find any that were really thin enough. And so eventually I did find a place that sold surgical stainless steel that does not corrode. It has a
Mhm.
very high tensile strength, and so you can like bend the heck out of it and it won't break. And so I just started ordering those in 6-foot lengths and cutting them to size. So I make my needles in various lengths, 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, depending on what I'm making my own needles, and that's what I use now completely. And I have various gauges.
So I'm assuming these are straight needles and not circular needles. Would that be
Oh,
correct?
yes. Yes, and, when I knit in the round, I just use, 4 or 5 needles that are
Yes, I see.
shorter in length, yeah, mhm,
Is there
so they're
anything
straight.
is there anything that stops the stitches from falling off at the end or?
No, not really, just I'm a very tight knitter, so they're on there pretty good. When I was using other types of needles, they would break, and so every now and then I would have a situation where the needle would break in the middle of a row, and some of the stitches, I would lose some of the stitches, so
Mm.
getting those stitches back onto the needle is always a fun challenge.
Oh, I
Um,
I could
yeah,
imagine. It
yeah. That
must be a special kind of process to actually try and pick
Yes,
up stitches on something
yes,
so small.
yeah, well, that's where you need a tiny crochet hook, that's where that comes in handy.
Mm. And I can see that from the beautiful blending on your pieces, that you must be either dyeing your own yarn or perhaps blending yarns together.
Well, yes. So when I said that there are certain things I don't do, one of them is I do not dye my own threads. I don't enjoy it. It's just not fun for me, but I need variegated threads. And as I become more skilled in my techniques, for example, the last sweater that I made, which was the Starry Night sweater, I really needed that sweater scape to look like a painting. And in order to do that, I needed threads that didn't exist. But I really didn't have the skills or techniques or knowledge to dye my own. And so what I did is I painstakingly, and I spent about a month or 2 just creating the threads for that piece. So what I would do is I would take very fine silk threads. It's hundredweight silk threads. They're Japanese. Some were 2-ply, some were 3-ply. And I mean, they have a nice large palette. Like there's a thread that I like called YLI, and the other, I think it's, oh gosh, I forget the name, Tiara, I think maybe. Um, and that's a 3-ply. And there's, each brand of those threads have maybe 30 or 40 different colors. So there's a pretty good variety of colors. And so I would unstrand them. So the 2-plies I would divide into one, and the 3-ply I also divide into one, and then I would mix them. So I would take those threads and combine them. Some of those threads are variegated. So while I has about 7 variegated threads, and so sometimes I would mix a solid with a variegated. That gave me colors that didn't exist, and they were still, even after those threads are so strong that I could divide them and they still were pretty stable, and I was able to then twist them together, and I used a little bobbin machine to really get them twisted tightly back together. But it was painstaking. It was just a really tedious process getting them separated and then winding them back together. And so I created this huge palette of threads, which I then made like a sampler so that I could sort of see what the colors would look like. So I would do like
Mm.
maybe 6 or so rows just to see what I would get. And then, I had already designed the pattern for that sweater. And this, by the way, was a sweater I've been wanting to make, a Starry Night sweater. I love Van Gogh. And I had really been wanting to do this for probably at least 10 years. I
Mm.
just I didn't have the skills until a couple of years ago. When I
It's absolutely beautiful. It really is
Thank you.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you actually manipulate the needles? Because that must be incredibly difficult to do at such a small scale.
Yes. Well, I have to say, there's really no special trick. even my hands even do shake a bit. They calm down after about an hour or so of knitting. But if I've had too much coffee that day, sometimes I'm just a little too shaky. Uh, but I do find like if I persevere, that I kind of get into a zone. I think most knitters will relate to that like, I don't know, it's mesmerizing, it's meditative, and it's calming. And so eventually, after I just keep knitting for a while, I find that my hands relax, and I get very excited to see my pattern emerge. And so it's even though I may have 200 or more stitches per row, each row I lay down, I can see that pattern emerge. I'm always so excited to visually see it, coming to life.
Mm.
That, it's just really, it steadies my hands. So, but I do use pretty high magnification. I'm very nearsighted. So I am actually able to, if I put my hands really close up to my eyes, I can knit that way if it's not extremely complicated. The really high detail sweaters, I really almost always need magnification to see it properly. But I just, I wear like a magnifying visor. They're not like a dentist. It's not like a dentist would use with his super high magnification, but it's more like a magnifying visor really helps. So other than that, the only other thing that I really try to do when I knit is to place my body ergonomically so that I'm not straining it horribly. And that means that I have to sit in a chair, like a reclining chair where my feet are up, kind of almost like a zero gravity position. And that I always have pillows on my lap with my elbows on the pillows so that my head is not cranked downward, because that'll pinch my nerves. And I have injured myself several times to the point where I can't knit because my hands go numb for months because of a
Yeah.
pinched nerve. So those are the things that I do to just technically get it done without hurting myself.
Yes, I can imagine, because any repetitive action is difficult, isn't it? But
Yes.
when you're trying to exert the level of control that I'm sure you must need at that size, that
Mhm.
must add an extra layer of difficulty.
Yes. Yes, for sure. And I have developed carpal tunnel, and arthritis in my hands. So it's
Mm.
becoming more difficult for me, slower going for me to do. I don't expect I'll be doing this into my 90s. I probably won't be able to do that. Um, so I don't know how many more sweaters I have in me. I have one visualized that I really, really would love to do. It would probably be the most complicated one to date, but that's just par for the course for me.
Mm.
But it's another one that I've been dreaming of for many years, that I'm just sort of waiting for my skills to be to up to the challenge.
And is it something that's based on a piece of art, an existing piece of
Yes.
art? Mhm.
Well, it's based on Arcimbaldo, Giuseppe Arcimbaldo. He's a painter from the 16th century who, I think he was very avant-garde in his art, and he created these fabulous paintings that were, fruit. It was like, portraits of people, but they were created out of fruit and vegetables or wild game, and so I have a visualization of a sweater that I want to make, that's based on that sort of three-dimensional portrait of a person with fruit. So whereas all my pieces are flat in a way, I mean they're shaped like sweaters, but there's nothing popping out from them. So the sweater that I am visualizing will actually be three-dimensional on the back, where the back is a portrait, but it'll be felted pieces. So I'm going to felt each little teeny tiny piece of fruit. So like be bunches of grapes, but each little grape will be individually knitted and then felted. And then it'll all be assembled on the back of the sweater with
My
the sort of
goodness. Mhm.
portrait popping out, and then I visualize the fruits. Either my I'm sort of thinking either the front of the sweater will have two-dimensional fruits kind of like knitted in, be very pretty, and then as they move toward the back of the sweater, they become three-dimensional until they form this, face popping out. Anyway, that's the visual that I have, and that's kind of the process that I go through with every sweater that I make is I have these ideas of how I wanna create something. Like when I did the Warhol sweater, the first thing that I thought of were the soup cans, and I wanted to do a pocket where the lid of the can would pop open and that would be the pocket, and so that's sort of how I visualize that, and I did eventually make that.
That sounds amazing. I mean, I suppose if you're going to felt fruit, you would need to be using wool, wouldn't you?
Right. Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Do they make wool that is fine enough for you to work with?
Yes, it's, there I have so this is where I may actually have to break down and dye my own because I have very, very, very fine it's a Shetland wool that is a wedding shawl lace wool, and it's quite thin, very beautiful, but it's all sort of a cream color. And so, yes, I have to figure out the best. I have dye. I did buy dye once upon a time. It's just, it's not one of my favorite things to do.
It's
And
messy, isn't it? It
it's
is
messy,
messy.
very messy. Yeah, yeah, very messy.
Are there any stitches that you just wouldn't use, that you wouldn't consider using or are too difficult? I mean, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is cable because of the difficulty of manipulating the cable needle. But I think you've already done cable, haven't you?
Oh, yes. I
Mm,
I really enjoy that. It is tricky because it's very, very tight, and especially if you're using silk. Silk doesn't have stretch. The cotton also doesn't stretch. Wool has a pretty nice give to it, so it's a little bit easier with wool. Um, but yeah, I like to do cables. I've done several sort of Aran type fisherman sweaters, which are really fun, and that adds a really nice dimension to a piece, which I really enjoy as well. One thing I'd like to try is Japanese knitting, which I think is really gorgeous. There's like a whole different. It's cabling, but it's a different technique, and the visual language of the Japanese cables and knitting is also very different than the standard. So all the symbols completely new and different language, which I would have to learn to do it, but I think it's really beautiful. It's kind of a combination of lace and cables together.
it
Um,
sounds wonderful. I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds gorgeous.
it is. It's gorgeous.
How long does each, I know they'll vary, obviously, but how long does each sweater take you approximately?
It completely depends on what it is. So, like I told you, the nativity sweater, the Starry Night sweater, those were probably a year to
Mm,
design and knit over time. It really just takes a lot of time.
yes,
Um,
I'm sure.
and I mean, there are weeks where I'll sit and knit for 13 hours a day, and maybe take a break for a week or two. So this is not constant. For something like an Aran fisherman sweater, maybe a month, I'd say, to make
Mm,
it if it's got sleeves and everything. It really all depends, but I am a very project-oriented person, and so when I start a project, I see it through to the end. I don't usually have several things going at once. I really like to start and finish a project before I move on to the next one. But as I'm knitting one project, I'm always thinking of the next one. So
mm,
you know, so much of the design happens in my brain. And so by the time I'm actually sitting down at my computer, and that's usually what I do first, is I'll sit down at the computer and I'll begin to just chart it, you know.
mm.
Um,
So you've
And
really worked it in your mind quite a few times before you
yeah,
actually work it in fact.
definitely.
Do you think that's one of the keys to actually getting it right? That you go over it so many times mentally before you start and you really do plan it very carefully?
Well, I've always felt like if I can design it, I can make it. So for me, and for my process, yes, I do think that's part of the success for me, that getting it charted and designed first usually translates because I know I can technically do it. I know that I can manipulate the needles and as long as I have the colors figured out and everything, then I know I can create it. Um,
Mm.
the one I described to you, the Arcimbaldo inspired sweater, that is a different situation because it will require some charting. Obviously, it'll be a sweater, but the back, as I said, the back of it will also be structural and sculptural, and so that will require a sort of a different more freehand, I guess. With that, it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to make a bunch of grapes. So now I know I'm going to knit
Yeah.
all these itty bitty teeny tiny things and then assemble them, onto the sweater. But yes, so for me, for my process, yes, I think designing and going over it so many times.
Mm.
And also, as I'm knitting, once I get the chart made, that's almost like a first draft in a way, or maybe, like the brain process is my first draft, and then putting it down on the chart is my second draft. And then as I knit, I always change my chart. So
You do.
I'll,
You cross off
yes,
as you go along. Yeah.
always, always, yes.
That
I redesign as I go. So the chart gives me a very good foundation, and but it's always I always change it.
Do you ever work to commission? Have you ever had anybody come along and say, I'd really like to commission this from you, or this sweater, or that cardigan, or
Mm. Well, yes and no. I'll just say right off the bat that I don't like doing commissions, and it would take a very like-minded person for me to accept a commission. So if it was something someone wanted that I thought, oh, I've been wanting to do something like that, I would s- I would, probably say yes. Mostly I just make what's in my mind's eye and hope that someday someone will love it and want to buy it, which is typically what has happened. So all those pieces that I've described to you before, they were all pieces that just were, something that I had in my head, I created, and people came along, either people who they're, museum collectors, private collectors, and different people like that. The Warhol sweater, for example, I sold to somebody who never collected miniatures or fiber art, but she has a very nice collection of Warhols, real Warhols, and her name happens to be Marilyn. So
oh, how
um,
fantastic!
she she did buy that piece, but I had already made it. It was not something that I made for her, but it it worked out perfectly, and it is displayed near one of Andy Warhol's last paintings. So it's a fun, interesting thing as well. But, like when I was contacted by Leica Studios back in 2007 when they were going to be making their very first feature-length film, and that was Coraline, and they wanted, that was a commission, and that was a fun type of thing that I get. But again, commission, I'm almost always like, no, no, not doing it. But it sounded interesting, and indeed it was, because even though the Coraline piece is certainly not anywhere near elaborate, not even close, it's pretty simple. I made the star sweater and I made the gloves for that movie.
Mm.
Um, and but they had their own challenges. I had to create fabric that would sparkle, and the gloves, I had to fit everything to those figures.
Mhm.
And that was an incredibly fun project. And I had to make, when the stop motion film had several different sets and of course several different characters. They don't take a character from one set and move it to the other set. So I had to make 15 sweaters
Oh
for
my
that.
goodness.
Yeah. So, and then I made, I think, 6 pairs of the striped gloves, and there were blue gloves as well that you see very briefly in the movie. She doesn't wear the
Mhm.
blue gloves, I don't think, but anyway, I did make those as well. I made a couple pairs of those.
That I suppose that working to, because it would have been to a deadline, I'm sure, because they would have been
Yes,
obviously,
right.
that must be very pressure inducing to have to work under that kind of deadline, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not great with schedules. I'm a much more um, I'm not a 9 to 5 type of worker, but when I do work, I can be very obsessive, and as I said, I can sit for 13 hours and knit. So, but it was it was okay because it was sort of a fun challenge, and the people that I was working for were so wonderful, and I loved working for, like, they actually even flew me out there a couple of times. To I got to meet the director, Henry Selick, and a lot of the people in the animation department, and I got to see them working on the characters and the different set pieces. And they also flew me out for the premiere, and I got to be involved with that. So it was just really fun. It was
Oh, how special. How
yeah,
wonderful.
it's really, really
What
special.
an amazing, yeah, what an amazing thing to be involved in.
Yeah.
Ah, that's fantastic. Do you still do any full scale knitting at all? Do you ever knit anything for yourself or friends or family, or is it all at a miniature scale?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't do much in full scale knitting, but lately, like I said, it's been a couple of years since my last miniature project, and that was the Starry Night project. And so, in order to try and, I don't know, dip my toes back in, I have started knitting some things from one of my favorite designers, Alice Starmore, and I just love her patterns. And I've knitted a couple of fingerless gloves for myself, and some really fun. She does these fabulous cuffs, really colorful, and parts of them are felted as well. So I'm kind of getting my fingers
You're
into
felting
the
practicing.
felting. Right. So yes, I mean, I've been doing that recently, and I love the color work. There's a lot of color change in those patterns, and cuffs, and some hats, and some collars. So, but nothing too big. Like, I just, a big sweater project, it doesn't interest me that much, trying to it because I really have gotten long time ago, I got away from thinking of knitting as something that needed to be worn or fitted on to people.
Mm.
It's just, I lost interest in that. And so it's just more fun for me to design and create these little things.
You must have a process, I suppose, at the end that you go through where you are thinking about how to display your pieces and also how to photograph them.
Right.
How does that work when you get to the end and you're really ready for presenting them as a finished piece?
So I love that question. And because it has been a very, very long, many, many years in trying to develop a way to display the pieces. When I think it was back in 2007, 8, 9, I can't remember exactly, but my my pieces were displayed in a show called Radical Lace and Subversive Knitting. That was a wonderful fiber art show that actually traveled around the country a little bit. It opened in the Museum of Art and Design in New York City, and my pieces were the only miniature pieces there. There were many other fiber artists there, so I was really honored to be in the company of some artists that I had known of and really admired for a very long time. And it was sort of starting there that I had to, begin to think about, how do I display my pieces so that they could be acceptable in a gallery setting and in a museum setting. And so I have finally really, I feel like, developed cases. So I along with my friend Bill Robertson, he helped me design cases for my pieces. And then I had a glass artist create bodices. So they're clear glass, and I sort of molded them with this plastic stuff first, and then I had these glass artists here in town. I live in Bloomington, Indiana. They created these beautiful little glass pieces, and you can't really see once the sweaters are on the glass, you can't really see them, but they're very beautiful. And then my friend Bill also, on his lathe, turned pedestals for me that I could then put on brass rods. And so the glass bodices go on brass rods, and they sit on turned brass pedestals. And then these cases, I create that with, I've had custom acrylic boxes made for them. So I do feel like I have finally figured out ways to display these pieces so they can hang on a wall, they can be on a shelf, they can be seen in the round, so you can, walk around them and see them from all angles. A very long process figuring that out.
Yes, I can imagine. I mean, it's lovely that you can see every single part of them, because so often art is sort of backed into a wall, isn't it? So you miss the
Right.
back of it completely.
That's right. Right.
Mm.
The other thing I do is I have had a high resolution images. So if in several of the gallery shows that I've been in, I've had posters made of the piece front and back so that people can go up to it and they can see, the piece, and then they can also next to it sort of see a blown up image of it
Yeah.
closer, in a photograph. Mhm.
Do you have people that collect your work, that are sort of waiting with bated breath for the next piece? Is that how it works?
Yeah, yes, it's not a huge, I wouldn't say, I don't know. I mean, it's not a huge, pool of collectors who are waiting with bated breath, but there are people who have collected my work. I'd say there's a museum in Kentucky, the Kentucky Gateway Museum. They have the largest collection of my pieces, and the director of that museum is an avid collector, and she often keeps an eye peeled, for what the
Uh-huh.
next thing is. She is somebody who I have done commissions for once or twice. And there's a museum in Kansas City, the Toy and Miniature Museum. And then, sometimes just out of the blue, somebody will contact me. They've seen my work. They, want to buy something, and that's always fun too, to find people who appreciate it, who aren't, necessarily collectors of miniatures, but they like the small scale of my work.
Do you have an agent that works on your behalf, or are you sort of speaking with people directly yourself?
Oh, no, no agent. I created my website, which I did a long, long time ago, and just sort of, tweak it every now and then. And I have a newsletter that people subscribe to, which I have not, I haven't sent a newsletter out probably in a couple of years. But, if I make something new, I'll usually post it on my website. And Yeah, so it's people just I really don't know exactly how they find me or hear about me. I will say the Coraline project just because, they did a little documentary and I'm in there. So sometimes people find me that way and it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yes, yes. No, I'm sure that it would have made a large difference because people will obviously see that and become
Right.
interested. So I just wondered, do you actually keep any of the pieces that you knit, or do they all go for sale? Are there some that you just wouldn't part with for any price?
Well, I there are probably a couple pieces that I've made that I've kept, but they're earlier pieces. There are some pieces that I've put an extremely high price tag on, which surprisingly have sold because I thought, well, I didn't really necessarily want to part with them or care, if they sold or not. So, but no, I typically most of the things that I make, I have sold or given as a gift to one of my children.
Mm. And then it's on to the next thing.
Yes. Mhm.
Yes. Mm. And what is next? Do you have any projects in the pipeline? I know obviously we discussed about the piece of the felting, but have you thought about doing any books or anything like that?
Well, I did do a book once. It's not at all anything that I would want to promote or, I sort of did it. It was a long time ago, and it certainly isn't anything I would produce today. It was more, it was a little bit instructional, and it was more about making pieces to put in jewelry or things like that.
Mhm.
I don't know. Anyway, I've thought about doing just sort of a picture book, but no, there's really nothing in the pipeline.
Mm.
Other than the Arcimbaldo, it's my sort of singular focus right now,
Do you
mentally.
Yes, it sounds as though it's going to take quite a lot to bring it together. There's so many
Yeah.
elements, aren't there?
Yes, there.
Do you ever teach?
Yes. I'm have taught at the International Guild of Miniature Artisans. It's at the Guild School. They have an annual week-long school in Castine, Maine, and so I've gone to teach there a few times. I've done weekend workshops a few times here and there. It's not something I do often. It does require a lot of preparation. I usually have
Mm.
to figure out a project that I know. uh, Everyone who takes my class has to obviously be a proficient knitter. They don't have to have ever knitted in miniature or small scale, but they have to be proficient and know how to knit very well. Um, so typically, I try to choose projects that most knitters would be able to do. I've taught an Aran sweater before. I've taught mittens, and I've been delighted that you know people can do it. They really can, as
Mhm.
long as they're good knitters. So it's been very fun, but it's exhausting. It takes a lot of work to prepare it. I have to provide, of course, all the materials,
Yes.
but I do enjoy doing it from time to time.
Yes, I suppose it's something that not everybody enjoys teaching, do they?
Right.
It's a very particular, I don't mean skill, but it is very people orientated. Um,
Yes. Yes. And it does take patience with people, so,
mm,
if someone drops a stitch, I've got to go over there. And of course, I've never done remote teaching or a YouTube video type of a class or anything like that, but
mm,
you know, I don't even know if it would be feasible because, there are a lot of skills that there's a lot of troubleshooting involved. So,
yeah, yeah.
somebody's knitting away and they've kind of done something, they've dropped a stitch or they've, you know, messed up a
Well,
row. I can undo it for them and put it back on the needles and, you know.
mm, but even that would be quite a long job, wouldn't it? I would think.
Yes. Yes.
Um, I mean, I know myself when I've taught taking classes that going from person to person and picking up wherever they are in the project can be
Yeah.
really mentally quite exhausting.
Right.
And I would have thought also quite challenging when you're working with something so small. It must be hard to see where someone is up to and try and put it right for them if they've gone wrong.
Yes, well, again, it's a challenge, and I like to troubleshoot. I really, it's not everybody likes to do that, so I definitely love to do it. I mean, I do a lot of home projects too. Sort of learned how to rewire things and do plumbing and build stuff, and all of that requires that same brain process of figuring out how you're going to do it, making mistakes, fixing those
Mm.
mistakes. I enjoy that.
Do you have any advice for somebody that might want to start to do micro knitting?
Well, I think uh, my advice for anybody as an artist or anybody who's really driven is definitely to follow your passions. That's my first piece of advice. But specifically regarding micro knitting is using the right materials will save you a lot of frustration. So, using the right tools, getting the right kinds of needles. I used to sell them, but I really don't anymore. It just was too much work and not worth it for me. But
Mm.
there are people who sell needles online, I think, that you can find, and the right threads. I mean, they're really I don't use yarn, I use threads. And so using the right kinds of threads makes a huge difference.
Mm.
You wouldn't want to start with silk because it's probably the most difficult material to work with. I would recommend a tatting cotton, or there are thin wools that you can find. But really, if you just go to a sewing shop and find spools of or a hobby shop, tatting cotton, it doesn't there's not a lot of give to it, but it's fairly easy to work with, and there are a lot of colors. I have never ever liked using embroidery thread, the threads that you
Mhm.
have to separate. I've never used them ever. Some people like them. I do not.
Mm.
Um, and then there are certain cottons that are soft. I think they're from Norway or something. I used to get something called a flower thread, which was a cotton, but it wasn't like a tightly twisted cotton like you'd buy as sewing thread. It was just soft and fuzzy. I think it was called coal cotton or something like that. But
Mm.
so there is a huge variety of lovely threads out there that can be used. And also use a magnifying visor of some sort. That'll make picking up stitches much easier. So those are my little pieces of
The
advice.
tips. Wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Althea, thank you so much for doing this today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and finding more out about micro knitting. It's been really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you, Gail. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.